The rain had finally broken through. Jonathan Ogden Armour stood in what used to be the grand ballroom of his family's Prairie Avenue mansion, watching water drip through a hole in the ornate plaster ceiling. Each drop hit the warped parquet floor with a hollow sound that echoed through the empty room. It was 1938, and the man whose grandfather had revolutionized American meatpacking, whose father had built the largest food empire in the world, couldn't afford to fix a leaking roof. The ballroom had once hosted presidents. Theodore Roosevelt had stood on these floors. William Howard Taft had dined in the room next door. Chicago's elite had competed for invitations to Armour parties, where champagne flowed and orchestras played until dawn. Now the crystal chandeliers hung dark and dusty. The silk wallpaper peeled in long strips. The marble fireplace, imported from Italy at enormous expense, was cracked from years of freezing winters with no heat. Jonathan was 65 years old. He had inherited an empire worth over $200 million in 1901. 37 years later, he was broke. The meatpacking plants were gone, sold off piece by piece to pay debts. The fortune had evaporated through bad investments, family disputes, and a fundamental failure to understand that the world was changing. The mansion that had cost over $1.5 million to build in 1880s dollars, over $45 million in today's money, was now worth less than the land it sat on. Outside, Prairie Avenue was dying too. Once called the Street of Millionaires, it had been Chicago's most exclusive address. George Pullman had lived 3 houses down. Marshall Field's mansion stood at the corner. The Glessner family occupied the house across the street, but one by one, the great families had fled. Some moved to the north side as industry crept closer. Others simply ran out of money. The neighborhood that had symbolized Chicago's rise from frontier town to industrial powerhouse was now surrounded by warehouses and factories, choked with smoke and noise. Jonathan walked through the empty rooms, his footsteps echoing on bare floors. Most of the furniture had been sold years ago. The paintings were gone. The rare books his father had collected, gone. Even the bronze fixtures had been stripped out and auctioned. What remained was just the shell, the bones of a palace that nobody wanted. The property taxes were 6 months overdue. The city had sent notices, warnings, threats. Jonathan had no way to pay them. He owned a mansion worth millions and couldn't afford $100 to stop the roof from leaking. This was the mathematics of ruin. This was what happened when empires built on meat and blood ran out of both. The decision facing him was simple and terrible. He could walk away, let the city take the property for taxes, watch it be demolished or decay. Or he could find anyone willing to take on this monument to his family's former glory. Either way, the Armour dynasty was over. This is the story of how Chicago's meatpacking royalty built the greatest fortune in American food history. How they constructed palaces to prove their arrival among the nation's elite. And how within 2 generations, it all collapsed into bankruptcy and abandonment, leaving behind only ruins and cautionary tales. If you enjoy exploring the rise and fall of America's industrial dynasties, hit that like button and subscribe. Let's begin at the beginning, before the empire, before the mansion, when the Armours were just another ambitious family chasing fortune in a young nation's chaos. Philip Danforth Armour was born on May 16, 1832, in Stockbridge, New York, into a family of modest means. His father was a farmer who struggled to feed 6 sons on rocky soil that yielded barely enough to survive. Philip was the 5th son, which meant he would inherit nothing. In 1832 America, that meant he had 2 choices: stay and work his father's failing farm for wages, or leave and make his own way. At 20 years old, Philip chose to leave. It was 1852, and news had reached Stockbridge about gold discovered in California 3 years earlier. Thousands of young men were heading west, convinced they would strike it rich in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Philip went too, not because he believed in easy gold, but because California represented opportunity. a place where a man with nothing could become something if he worked hard enough and stayed smart. He didn't find gold. Almost nobody did. The easy strikes were long gone by 1852, claimed by the first wave of prospectors. What Philip found instead was a more reliable path to wealth, providing services to the miners who were still searching. He started a small operation digging water ditches and sluices for mining operations. The work was brutal, dawn to dusk under the California sun, but it paid. In 5 years, Philip saved $8,000, a fortune for a farm boy from New York. That $8,000 would change everything. In 1856, Philip returned east, but he didn't go back to Stockbridge. He went to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where one of his brothers had established a small grain business. Philip saw opportunity there. Milwaukee was positioned perfectly on the western edge of the Great Lakes, a natural hub for agricultural products flowing from the fertile Wisconsin and Minnesota farmlands toward eastern markets. Philip invested his California earnings in a grain commission business with a partner named John Plankinton. They bought grain from farmers, stored it in warehouses, and sold it to eastern buyers at a markup. It was simple, unglamorous work, but Philip understood something fundamental about American business in the 1850s. Fortunes weren't made by producing things. They were made by controlling the supply chain between producers and consumers. The grain business did well, but Philip's ambitions went beyond buying and selling wheat. In 1863, during the Civil War, he saw an opportunity that would define the rest of his life. The Union Army needed meat, enormous quantities of it, to feed hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The government was paying premium prices for pork and beef. No questions asked about quality or origin. Philip borrowed heavily and invested everything in a pork packing operation. He bought live hogs from farmers, slaughtered them in Milwaukee, packed the meat in barrels with salt, and shipped it to Union Army contractors. The margins were enormous. A hog that cost $3 alive could be sold for $10 as packed pork. During the 4 years of the Civil War, Philip Armour made his first fortune, estimated at over $2 million. But Philip understood something that many war profiteers didn't. The war would end, and the easy money would disappear. He needed to build something permanent, something that would last beyond government contracts. In 1867, he moved his operations to Chicago, the city that was becoming the transportation and industrial center of the entire Midwest. Chicago was perfect for Philip's vision. The Union stockyards had opened on Christmas Day, 1865, consolidating several smaller stockyards into one massive facility on the south side. Railroads from across the country converged in Chicago, bringing millions of cattle and hogs from western ranches and farms. The Great Lakes provided water transportation to eastern cities. And most importantly, Chicago had ambition. The city was growing explosively, filled with men like Philip who saw opportunity in the chaos of post-war industrial expansion. Philip partnered with John Plankinton again, establishing Armour Company in a small facility near the stockyards. The operation was simple: buy live animals, slaughter them, process the meat, pack it for shipment. What made Philip different was his obsession with efficiency and his willingness to use every part of the animal. Most packers in the 1870s focused on the premium cuts of meat and discarded the rest. Philip saw waste as opportunity. He hired chemists to figure out what could be done with blood, bones, hooves, hair, internal organs. The answer was almost everything. Blood could be processed into fertilizer. Bones could be ground into meal or used to make buttons. Hooves yielded glue. Internal organs became sausage casings or pet food. Hair was sold to brush manufacturers. Philip's philosophy was simple: we use everything but the squeal. It became the company motto, and it made the difference between modest profits and spectacular ones. While competitors threw away 30% of each animal, Armour Company monetized 98%. That margin advantage allowed Philip to underprice competitors while maintaining higher profits. By 1875, Armour Company was processing over 500,000 hogs annually and had expanded into cattle. The operation employed over 2,000 workers in sprawling facilities near the stockyards. Philip's personal wealth was estimated at $5 million, an enormous fortune that placed him among Chicago's richest men. But Philip wasn't satisfied. He looked at the meatpacking business and saw a fundamental problem: spoilage. Meat was highly perishable. In summer heat, it rotted within days. This limited the market to local consumption or expensive preservation methods like smoking and salting that degraded quality. If meat could be kept fresh longer, the potential market would expand dramatically. The solution came from an unexpected source. Gustavus Swift, another Chicago meatpacker, had developed a refrigerated railroad car that could keep meat cold during shipping. The technology was revolutionary. Fresh meats slaughtered in Chicago could reach New York in perfect condition. The eastern cities, with their dense populations and high prices, suddenly became accessible markets. Philip immediately understood the implications. He invested heavily in refrigerated rail cars, building his own fleet and contracting with railroads for priority shipping. By 1880, Armour Company was shipping fresh meat to every major city east of the Mississippi. The business exploded. Annual revenues exceeded $20 million. Philip's personal fortune reached $10 million. Success bred competition. Swift was expanding aggressively. The Morris family started their own packing operation. Nelson Morris, another ambitious packing house owner, built facilities that rivaled Armour's. Chicago's Union stockyards became the battleground for an industry that was reshaping American diet and agriculture. Philip fought back by expanding into processed meats. Armour Company introduced canned meats, sausages, bacon brands, lunch meats. Each product line required marketing, distribution networks, and quality control. Philip built a national sales force, opened distribution centers in every major city, and advertised aggressively in newspapers and magazines. By 1885, Armour Company was the largest meat packer in America, processing over 2 million animals annually. The company employed over 10,000 workers. Annual revenues exceeded $100 million. Philip Danforth Armour, the fifth son of a failing farmer, had built one of the largest industrial enterprises in the United States. He was 53 years old and one of the richest men in America. Now he needed to prove it. In the 1880s, wealth without display was meaningless. Chicago's elite, the men who had built fortunes in railroads, grain, lumber, and meat, competed to demonstrate their success through architectural excess. The grandest homes weren't just residences. They were statements of dominance, proof that the owner had arrived at the pinnacle of industrial society. Prairie Avenue became the stage for this competition. Located on the south side, close enough to the Loop business district for convenience but far enough south to escape the worst industrial smoke, Prairie Avenue attracted Chicago's wealthiest families. George Pullman, the railroad car magnate, built a massive Second Empire mansion there in 1873. Marshall Field, the department store king, constructed an even larger residence nearby. John J. Glessner commissioned the famous architect H.H. Richardson to design a revolutionary stone fortress that still stands today. Philip Armour watched these palaces rise and understood that his own residence was inadequate. He had been living in a comfortable but modest home on Prairie Avenue since moving to Chicago. It was fine for a businessman on the rise, but not for the owner of America's largest meatpacking empire. If he wanted social acceptance, if he wanted his family to be recognized as genuine aristocracy rather than nouveau riche packing house owners, he needed a palace that nobody could ignore. In 1879, Philip purchased additional lots on Prairie Avenue, assembling a property large enough for something spectacular. He hired the architectural firm of Treat and Foltz, known for designing elaborate mansions for Chicago's elite. The instructions were simple: build the finest residence on Prairie Avenue, spare no expense, and make it clear that the Armour family had arrived. Construction began in 1880 and continued for over 2 years. The final structure was overwhelming. 3 stories of brick and limestone, mansard roof with elaborate ironwork, over 30 rooms filled with the finest materials money could buy. The entry hall featured a grand staircase of carved mahogany that rose 3 full stories, lit by an enormous skylight of stained glass. The ballroom could accommodate 200 guests and featured gilded plasterwork on the 18-foot ceilings. The library held over 3,000 volumes, many bound in leather and purchased by the foot to fill the custom-built walnut shelves. The dining room could seat 40 people at a table made from a single massive piece of mahogany. The chairs were upholstered in silk, the china was French, the crystal came from Baccarat. Above the table hung 3 chandeliers, each with over 100 gas jets that could be lit for evening dinners, transforming the room into a blaze of light that impressed even the most jaded visitors. The second floor contained the family bedrooms, each with its own fireplace, elaborate woodwork, and modern conveniences like indoor plumbing with hot running water. Philip's master bedroom suite included a private bath with a tub carved from marble, fed by water heated in boilers in the basement. His wife Malvina's suite was decorated in the French style with gilded furniture and silk wallpaper imported from Paris. The third floor held additional bedrooms for guests and children, plus servants' quarters. The basement contained the boilers, storage rooms, wine cellars, and servant work areas. The house required a staff of 15 to operate properly: cooks, maids, footmen, a butler, groundskeepers. They worked constantly to maintain the mansion's perfection, ensuring that every surface gleamed and every detail was flawless. The final cost exceeded $1.5 million, equivalent to over $45 million today. It was the most expensive private residence in Chicago at the time, surpassing even Marshall Field's mansion. Philip had gotten what he paid for, a palace that announced Armour supremacy, that proved the meatpacker from New York farm country had become industrial royalty. The mansion opened in 1882 with a reception that was reported in every Chicago newspaper. Over 300 guests attended, including city officials, business leaders, and society figures who had previously looked down on the Armours as mere tradesmen. They toured the rooms, admired the decorations, ate elaborate dinners prepared by French chefs Philip had hired for the occasion. By the end of the evening, Chicago understood. The Armour family could not be ignored. But Philip barely enjoyed his palace. He was 50 years old when it was completed, and he had no intention of slowing down. The meatpacking business consumed him completely. He spent 12 to 14 hours a day at the packing houses, walking through the operations, checking on quality, negotiating with cattle buyers, planning expansions. The mansion was Malvina's domain. She hosted the parties, managed the staff, ensured their children were raised properly, and introduced to Chicago society. Philip and Malvina had 3 children who survived to adulthood. The eldest was Philip Danforth Armour Jr., born in 1869, who everyone called PD. The second was a daughter, Barbara, born in 1871. The youngest was Jonathan Ogden Armour, born in 1863 but often overlooked in favor of his older brother. PD was being groomed to inherit the business, receiving the education and attention that came with being the heir to an empire. The family dynamic was complicated. Philip Sr. loved his children but had little time for them. The business always came first. PD was sent to Yale to be educated alongside the sons of Eastern aristocracy, learning the social graces and connections that would help him lead the company when the time came. Jonathan attended Sheffield Scientific School at Yale, receiving a more technical education. Barbara was raised to marry well, to further elevate the family's social position through a strategic alliance with another wealthy family. Philip Sr. believed deeply in education and philanthropy, not from altruism, but from understanding that social acceptance required more than money. In 1890, he founded the Armour Institute of Technology, donating over $1 million to establish a school that would train engineers and technicians. The institute was Philip's attempt to give back to Chicago while also ensuring a steady supply of educated workers for Armour and Company's increasingly complex operations. The 1890s were the peak years. Armour and Company's revenues exceeded $200 million annually. The company operated facilities in Chicago, Kansas City, and Omaha, processing over 5 million animals per year. Philip's personal fortune was estimated at $50 million, making him one of the 20 richest men in America. The Prairie Avenue Mansion hosted presidents and senators. The family name appeared constantly in newspapers, associated with business success, philanthropy, and social prominence. But Philip was 60 years old, and the work was killing him. The stress of managing such a vast enterprise, the constant competition from Swift and Morris, the labor disputes, the railroad negotiations, the financial complexity of operating what was essentially a national food monopoly, all took their toll. He developed heart problems. His doctors told him to slow down, to delegate more, to enjoy the fortune he had built. Philip couldn't do it. The business was his identity. Without the daily grind of the packing house, who was he? A rich man who smelled like blood and money? He kept working, kept pushing, kept expanding the company even as his body warned him to stop. On January 6, 1901, Philip Danforth Armour died of heart failure at his Prairie Avenue mansion. He was 68 years old. He had worked until the final week of his life, still going to the packing houses, still checking on operations, still planning expansions. When he died, he left behind a meatpacking empire that dominated American food production and a fortune estimated at $50 million. The funeral was one of the largest Chicago had ever seen. Thousands of workers from the packing houses lined the streets. Business leaders, politicians, and society figures filled the church. Philip was eulogized as a self-made man, an industrial titan who had risen from nothing to build one of America's great enterprises. The newspapers called him a genius, a philanthropist, a man who had transformed Chicago from a frontier town into an industrial powerhouse. What none of the eulogies mentioned was the more complicated truth. Philip had built his fortune on brutal labor practices, monopolistic business methods, and a ruthless willingness to crush competitors. The packing house workers who lined the streets for his funeral earned less than $2 a day for exhausting, dangerous work. Many of them would be seriously injured or killed in the packing houses Philip had designed for efficiency rather than safety. But in 1901, those concerns were secondary. What mattered was that Philip Danforth Armour had died at the peak of his power, leaving behind an empire for his sons to inherit. The question was whether they could maintain what their father had built, or whether the fortune would follow the pattern of so many American industrial dynasties. Spectacular rise, brief peak, then slow collapse into irrelevance. The answer would reveal itself over the next 37 years, as the Armour Empire was slowly destroyed by family disputes, business failures, and a fundamental inability to adapt to changing times. The mansion on Prairie Avenue would witness all of it, transforming from a symbol of triumph into a monument to failure. Philip Danforth Armour Jr., known as PD, inherited control of Armour and Company when his father died. He was 32 years old, Yale-educated, familiar with the business from working alongside his father for over a decade. He seemed perfectly positioned to lead the company into the 20th century. The transition appeared smooth. PD was named president, and the board expressed complete confidence in the family's continued leadership. But PD lacked his father's obsessive drive. Philip Sr. had built the empire through 16-hour days and relentless attention to every detail. He had been a workaholic who found purpose and identity in the packing houses. PD was different. He had been raised wealthy, educated at Yale, accustomed to a life of comfort and social prominence. He understood the business intellectually, but he didn't have his father's hunger, that desperate need to prove himself that had driven Philip Sr. from farm boy to industrial titan. The first few years went well enough. Armour and Company continued operating on the momentum Philip Sr. had built. The contracts were established, the distribution networks functioned smoothly, and the brand recognition ensured steady sales. Annual revenues remained above $200 million. The company still processed more animals than any competitor. From the outside, everything looked fine. But inside the company, problems were emerging. PD delegated more than his father had, trusting managers to handle operations that Philip Sr. had personally overseen. Some of those managers were competent, others were not. Quality control began to slip. Stories circulated about contaminated meat, about unsanitary conditions in the packing houses, about workers cutting corners to meet production quotas. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, a novel that exposed the horrifying conditions inside Chicago's packing houses. Sinclair had spent weeks working undercover in the plants, documenting everything he saw. The book described rats running freely through meat processing areas, workers with tuberculosis coughing on the meat, poisoned rats being ground into sausage, and meat that fell on filthy floors being processed and sold. The public response was explosive. Sales of meat products collapsed almost overnight. The packing houses, including Armour, were suddenly objects of disgust rather than industrial pride. President Theodore Roosevelt ordered an investigation. The resulting Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 imposed federal inspections and quality standards on the meatpacking industry for the first time. PD and the other packers fought the regulations, but they lost. The new laws required significant investments in cleaner facilities, proper refrigeration, and inspector access. These costs ate into profit margins that were already declining due to increased competition and falling meat prices. Armour and Company's dominance was slipping, and PD seemed unable to stop it. The situation was complicated by family dynamics. PD's younger brother Jonathan also worked for the company, but he was overshadowed by the older son who had been groomed for leadership. Their sister Barbara had married into another wealthy Chicago family and had no direct involvement in the business. Malvina, the matriarch, remained in the Prairie Avenue mansion, aging and increasingly disconnected from the company that bore her late husband's name. The mansion itself was becoming a burden. Property taxes had risen significantly as Prairie Avenue property values increased. The staff of 15 required annual salaries of over $20,000 combined. Maintenance was constant and expensive. The heating system consumed enormous amounts of coal. The house was designed to impress visitors with lavish entertaining, but that required constant expenditure on food, wine, flowers, musicians. Every party cost thousands of dollars. In the early 1900s, these costs were manageable. The company was still generating massive revenues, and PD's personal compensation was substantial. But the combination of declining company performance and rising mansion expenses was creating pressure. The mathematics that had seemed infinite when Philip Sr. was alive were becoming finite under his son's management. PD also faced competition from within his own industry. Gustavus Swift had died in 1903, but his sons were aggressively expanding Swift & Company. The Morris family was building new facilities. Smaller regional packers were emerging in cities across the country. The near monopoly that Philip Sr. had established was fragmenting into genuine competition. The biggest challenge was technological change. The industry was shifting toward processed and branded products rather than simple fresh meat. Companies that could develop popular brands and market them nationally would capture the highest margins. Armour had some branded products, but the company was fundamentally organized around commodity meat production. Reorienting the entire business model would require vision and boldness that PD didn't possess. He tried. In 1908, Armour launched a major advertising campaign for branded products like Armour Bacon and Armour canned ham. The company invested in new processing facilities designed specifically for consumer products rather than wholesale meat. PD hired marketing experts from Eastern advertising firms, paying them salaries that shocked the old-line packing house managers who had worked for Philip Sr. The investments helped, but they weren't enough. Swift was moving faster, developing stronger brands, capturing market share. The profit margins at Armour & Company continued declining. By 1910, annual revenues had actually decreased to around $180 million despite overall market growth. The company was losing ground. PD was also spending heavily on personal luxuries. He purchased a yacht, commissioned a summer estate in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and maintained a lifestyle that rivaled the Eastern aristocracy he had studied with at Yale. These expenditures weren't unusual for a man of his wealth and position, but they accelerated at exactly the wrong time. Just as company performance was declining, the family dynamics grew more strained. Jonathan felt increasingly sidelined despite his technical competence and understanding of the business. He believed PD was mismanaging the company through inattention and poor delegation. The brothers had heated arguments about strategy, about investments, about whether to focus on wholesale or retail operations. Their mother Malvina tried to mediate, but lacked the business knowledge to evaluate their competing claims. In 1912, tragedy struck in a way nobody anticipated. PD became seriously ill with what doctors initially diagnosed as a severe flu. He recovered partially, but remained weakened. Over the following months, his condition deteriorated. By late 1913, he was barely able to work. In January 1914, Philip Danforth Armour Jr. died at age 45 of what was later determined to be complications from pneumonia. The death devastated the family. PD had been the heir, the one groomed for leadership, the son who was supposed to carry the empire forward. Now he was gone, leaving behind a widow and children who were too young to take over. The company needed leadership immediately. Jonathan Ogden Armour became president of Armour & Company at age 51. He had worked for the company his entire adult life, but always in his brother's shadow. Now he had the opportunity to prove himself, to show that he could manage the empire his father had built. He approached the role with determination, immediately implementing changes he believed would reverse the company's declining performance. Jonathan was more hands-on than PD had been, more willing to involve himself in operational details. He personally toured the packing houses, meeting with foremen, observing production processes, identifying inefficiencies. He cut costs aggressively, eliminating positions he considered redundant, renegotiating supplier contracts, reducing inventory levels. Some of his changes worked. Profit margins improved slightly in 1915 and 1916. The company's financial position stabilized, but Jonathan had inherited deeper problems than inefficiency. The entire meatpacking industry was changing in ways that threatened the business model Philip Sr. had built. World War I provided temporary relief. The U.S. Army and Allied forces needed enormous quantities of meat. Government contracts poured in, just as they had during the Civil War that had given Philip Sr. his first fortune. Armour & Company's revenues surged past $200 million out again, reaching nearly $300 million by 1917. Jonathan was celebrated as the man who had saved the family business. But the war boom was artificial, dependent on government demand that would disappear the moment peace was declared. Jonathan knew this intellectually, but the financial pressure was too great to resist the easy money. Instead of using the war profits to invest in long-term restructuring, he used them to maintain the lifestyle and properties that the family had accumulated. The Prairie Avenue mansion was becoming increasingly problematic. The neighborhood was changing. Industry had crept closer. The stockyards, once several miles away, had expanded until the smell of blood and rendering plants reached Prairie Avenue on days when the wind blew from the south. Wealthy families were leaving, moving to the north side or to new suburbs accessible by train. George Pullman's mansion stood empty after his widow died. Marshall Field's family had moved to a newer, grander estate elsewhere. The Glessners remained, but they were increasingly isolated. Prairie Avenue was transforming from Millionaire's Row into a middle-class neighborhood surrounded by industrial facilities. The mansion that had once been the crown jewel of Chicago's most exclusive street was now an aging palace in a declining area. Jonathan faced a decision: move the family to a more fashionable location, which would require selling the Prairie Avenue mansion at a loss and building or purchasing something equally impressive elsewhere, or stay and watch the neighborhood continue its decline. He chose to stay, partially from sentiment, partially from financial necessity. The mansion was worth far less than it had cost to build. Selling would crystallize a loss that Jonathan preferred to avoid acknowledging. His mother Malvina died in 1919 at age 80. She had lived in the mansion for 37 years, presiding over its glory days and witnessing the beginning of its decline. Her death marked the end of an era. The woman who had hosted presidents and society figures was gone. The generation that had built the Armour Empire had passed. Now it was up to Jonathan and his generation to maintain what had been created. The responsibility was overwhelming. Jonathan was 56 years old when his mother died, and he was exhausted. The war had ended, and with it the lucrative government contracts. Armour and Company's revenues fell sharply in 1920 as the military stopped buying meat. Civilian demand didn't fully replace the lost government orders. The company faced a post-war recession that hit the entire industry hard. Competition was intensifying. Swift had emerged from the war years in stronger financial position than Armour. New competitors like Wilson & Company were capturing market share with innovative products and aggressive marketing. The Federal Trade Commission was investigating the major packers for antitrust violations, threatening to break up the industry's largest firms. Jonathan fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. He defended the company against federal regulators, competed with Swift and others for market share, tried to develop new products, managed labor disputes as unions organized packing house workers, and dealt with family members who expected their dividends to continue regardless of company performance. It was an impossible situation, and Jonathan was increasingly overwhelmed. The mansion expenses continued relentlessly. Property taxes exceeded $30,000 annually by the early 1920s. The staff costs, maintenance, heating, all the expenses that came with operating a palace consumed over $75,000 per year. Jonathan's personal wealth was substantial, but it was mostly tied up in Armour & Company stock. When the company's performance declined, his paper wealth decreased. When dividends were cut to preserve capital, his cash income dropped. He began making compromises. The staff was reduced from 15 to 10, then to 7. Some rooms were closed off to save on heating. The elaborate parties stopped. The mansion that had once hosted hundreds of guests now sat mostly empty, occupied by Jonathan, his wife, and their children, rattling around in 30 rooms designed for a very different lifestyle. Jonathan's children were coming of age. His son Philip D. Armour III was being groomed to eventually take over the company, continuing the family tradition. But Philip III showed even less interest in the meatpacking business than his uncle P.D. had. He was more interested in horse racing and society life than in packing house operations. Jonathan watched with growing concern as his son demonstrated exactly the entitled attitude that would doom the family fortune. The 1920s were brutal for Armour & Company. The company faced one disaster after another. A major fire destroyed a Kansas City facility in 1922, causing millions in losses. A price war with Swift in 1923 devastated profit margins. Labor strikes in 1924 shut down production for weeks. The Federal Trade Commission's antitrust investigation concluded in 1920 with a consent decree that limited how the major packers could operate. preventing them from expanding into unrelated food businesses and restricting their market power. Each setback reduced the company's value and Jonathan's personal wealth. The stock that had been worth $200 per share when his father died was trading at $60 by 1925. Jonathan owned hundreds of thousands of shares, so his paper wealth had declined by tens of millions of dollars. The fortune that had seemed infinite was proving very finite. By 1927, Jonathan was 64 years old and seriously considering retirement. His health was declining. The stress of managing a struggling company while watching the family fortune evaporate was taking a physical toll. He had done everything he could think of to save the business, but the fundamental problem remained. The industry had changed, and Armour Company hadn't changed with it. The company that Philip Sr. had built was designed for a world of wholesale commodity meat. That world was disappearing, replaced by branded consumer products, retail chains, and national advertising. Swift understood this and had successfully transitioned. Armour was still fighting the previous war, still organized around stockyards and railroad cars when the market wanted Spam and hot dogs in every grocery store. Jonathan began planning succession. His son Philip III would inherit his shares and board position, but Jonathan wasn't confident the young man could lead the company. He considered bringing in professional management, executives with no family connection, but expertise in modern food marketing and operations. The board resisted. Armour Company had always been family-controlled. Bringing in outsiders felt like admitting defeat. The decision was made for them by events nobody anticipated. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed. Within weeks, the Great Depression had begun, and with it came the complete destruction of whatever remained of the Armour Empire. The disaster that had been unfolding slowly for nearly 30 years accelerated into catastrophic failure. The stock market crash devastated Armour Company immediately. The stock price, which had already declined from $200 to $60 over the previous decade, collapsed to $15 in a matter of weeks. Jonathan's personal wealth evaporated almost overnight. Shares that had been worth tens of millions were suddenly worth a fraction of that. But the paper losses were just the beginning. The real disaster was what happened to the business. Consumer demand for meat plummeted as unemployment soared and incomes collapsed. People who had routinely bought steak and roasts switched to cheaper cuts or eliminated meat entirely. Armour's revenues fell by 30% in the first year of the Depression, then another 20% the following year. The company that had once generated $300 million annually was struggling to reach $100 million. The fixed costs remained unchanged. The packing houses still required maintenance whether they were running at full capacity or not. The workers still needed to be paid, though Jonathan cut wages ruthlessly to preserve cash. The debt obligations still had to be serviced. The company had borrowed heavily during the 1920s to finance expansions that now looked foolish. Those loans were coming due, and Armour didn't have the cash to pay them. Jonathan made desperate choices. He sold off assets, closed facilities, laid off thousands of workers, and cut every expense he could identify. The Kansas City plant was sold. The Omaha operations were scaled back dramatically. The company retreated to its Chicago base, trying to survive by becoming smaller and more focused. It wasn't enough. In 1933, Armour Company defaulted on its debt obligations. The banks forced a reorganization that gave creditors control of the company in exchange for extending the loan terms. Jonathan remained as nominal president, but he no longer controlled the enterprise his father had built. The family ownership had been diluted to the point of irrelevance. The Armour Empire, which had once been the largest meatpacking operation in the world, was now just another struggling food company controlled by bankers. Jonathan was 70 years old. His health was failing. His fortune was gone. The company that bore his father's name was bankrupt in all but name. And he still owned the Prairie Avenue Mansion, that monument to the empire's peak that now cost more to maintain than he could afford. The mansion was in decay. The roof leaked in multiple places. The plaster was cracked and water-stained. The heating system was failing, and Jonathan couldn't afford to replace it. Some rooms were kept heated minimally during winter, but large sections of the house were simply closed off, allowed to freeze. The elaborate parquet floors warped from moisture and temperature changes. The silk wallpaper peeled. The gilded plasterwork in the ballroom flaked away. The staff was gone except for one elderly couple who served as caretakers. They did their best, but two people couldn't maintain 30 rooms. Dust accumulated. Windows remained unwashed. The gardens returned to wilderness. The mansion that had required 15 servants to operate properly was being maintained by two people working for minimal wages because Jonathan couldn't afford to pay more. The property taxes were years in arrears. The city had filed liens against the property. Jonathan received regular notices threatening seizure and auction. He had no way to pay. His income had collapsed along with the company's fortunes. What little money he had went to basic living expenses. The taxes on a mansion worth millions were simply beyond his capacity. His children offered no help. Philip III had his own financial problems, having spent freely during the boom years and now facing his own creditors. Barbara's husband had been ruined by the stock market crash. The extended family, once bound together by shared wealth, had fragmented into isolated households, each struggling with their own disasters. Jonathan walked through the empty mansion and saw his father's ghost. Philip Sr. had built this palace to prove Armour supremacy, to establish the family as Chicago royalty. He had spent over $1.5 million creating something that would last forever. 60 years later, it was dying from neglect and financial starvation. The fortune that built it had vanished. The company that generated that fortune was controlled by creditors. The family that bore the name was broke. The decision facing Jonathan was simple and terrible. He could walk away, let the city take the property for unpaid taxes, watch it be demolished or decay into ruin. Or he could try to find someone willing to take on this monument to his family's former glory. Neither option was good, but abandonment seemed preferable to watching the slow death continue. In 1938, Jonathan Ogden Armour, age 75, simply stopped going to the Prairie Avenue mansion. He moved into a small apartment on the north side, bringing with him only what he could carry. The mansion was left to the caretaker couple with instructions to maintain what they could for as long as possible. No money changed hands because Jonathan didn't have any money to give them. He just walked away from the palace his father had built, unable to afford it, unable to save it, unable even to properly abandon it. The city eventually seized the property for unpaid taxes in 1939. The total tax debt had reached over $80,000, a sum that exceeded the property's market value. The building itself was assessed at $150,000, less than 10% of what it had cost to build 57 years earlier. The city held an auction, hoping some buyer would emerge. Nobody bid. A mansion that had cost $1.5 million to build, that had hosted presidents and society figures, that represented the peak of Chicago's industrial age, had no buyers at any price. The combination of massive maintenance costs, declining neighborhood, and depression economics made it worthless. It was too expensive to maintain as a residence, too large to convert to commercial use, and too costly to demolish properly. The mansion sat empty through World War II. Vandals broke in and stripped everything of value. The bronze fixtures were pried off and sold for scrap. The mahogany paneling was torn out. The marble mantels were removed and hauled away. The parquet floors were pulled up. What couldn't be easily removed was destroyed. Windows were smashed. Walls were damaged. The interior was systematically gutted. By 1945, the Prairie Avenue mansion was a hollow shell. The exterior walls stood, but the interior was destroyed. The roof had partially collapsed, allowing rain and snow to pour in. The elaborate plasterwork had fallen away. The grand staircase was gone. The ballroom where presidents had danced was open to the sky. Jonathan Ogden Armour died in 1943 at age 80, living in a modest apartment, supported by a small pension from the reorganized Armour and Company that he no longer controlled. He never returned to the mansion after walking away in 1938. His obituary mentioned his business career and his father's legacy, but it didn't mention the mansion. That story was already over. Philip III survived his father by several years but never recovered financially. The Armour fortune that had once been estimated at $200 million had been completely destroyed within 40 years of Philip Sr.'s death. The company continued operating, eventually merging with other firms and losing the family name entirely. By the 1980s, Armour and Company had been absorbed into Conagra Foods, and the name that had once dominated American meatpacking was reduced to a brand label on canned products. The mansion on Prairie Avenue stood as a ruin through the 1950s and 1960s. Various proposals emerged to save it. Preservation groups argued it should be restored as a historic landmark, representing Chicago's Gilded Age industrial wealth. But the cost was prohibitive. The building would require millions of dollars to restore properly, and in post-war Chicago, nobody was interested in celebrating robber baron excess. In 1972, the Chicago Architecture Foundation placed a historic marker on the property, noting its significance as the former Armour family residence. But the building itself continued to decay. The city considered demolition multiple times, but couldn't afford the cost of properly bringing down such a massive structure. So it remained, a slowly collapsing monument to industrial wealth and its impermanence. Parts of the original mansion's materials were salvaged over the years. Some marble mantels ended up in museums. Pieces of the mahogany paneling were rescued and installed in other historic buildings. The elaborate ironwork from the mansard roof was saved by collectors, but the structure itself was lost, demolished in pieces by time and neglect rather than by any conscious decision. Today, the lot where the Armour Mansion stood is empty. A modern development has replaced the ruins, and only the historical marker remains to indicate what once occupied the site. Prairie Avenue itself has been partially preserved as a historic district. The Glessner House, designed by H. Richardson, has been restored and operates as a museum. But the Armour Mansion, which once overshadowed everything else on the street, exists only in photographs and records. The story of the Armour family and their mansion encapsulates the trajectory of so many American industrial dynasties. Spectacular rise from nothing, enormous wealth concentrated in one generation, gradual decline as the fortune is divided and circumstances change, then complete collapse leaving only ruins and cautionary tales. Philip Danforth Armour built his fortune through brutal efficiency and ruthless competition in an era when such methods were celebrated rather than regulated. He transformed American meat consumption, created thousands of jobs, and established Chicago as the food processing capital of the nation. His accomplishments were real and significant, but he also built his empire on exploitative labor practices, monopolistic business methods, and an industry that caused enormous environmental damage. The mansion was Philip's attempt to translate industrial wealth into social acceptance, to prove that a farm boy from New York and a packing house owner could become aristocracy through sheer force of money. It worked for a time. The family was received in Chicago's highest social circles. Presidents visited. The Armour name carried weight and respect. But the attempt to create permanent dynasty through architectural excess failed completely. The mansion required constant infusions of money to survive. When the business declined and the fortune evaporated, the palace became impossible to maintain. It survived Philip by only 37 years, dying of the same thing that killed the Vanderbilt's breakers, the mathematics of unsustainable excess. The difference was that the breakers was saved by becoming public, by opening its doors and letting admission tickets pay for maintenance. The Armour Mansion never found that solution. Perhaps the damage was too severe by the time anyone thought to try preservation. Perhaps the location was too compromised by industrial encroachment. Perhaps the family's decline was too rapid and too complete to allow for thoughtful planning. Whatever the reasons, the result was demolition by neglect. The palace built to last forever was destroyed within a human lifetime. The fortune meant to establish permanent wealth was exhausted within 2 generations. The dynasty that was supposed to rival the Vanderbilts and Rockefellers disappeared, leaving behind only scattered artifacts and historical footnotes. The Armour Meatpacking empire survived in diminished form for decades after the mansion was gone. The company continued operating through various restructurings and ownership changes, but the family connection was severed completely. The business that bore Philip's name became just another corporate entity, bought and sold, merged and reorganized, until even the name was reduced to a brand rather than representing actual ownership. Today, if you visit Chicago and look for evidence of the Armour dynasty, you'll find very little. The Armour Institute of Technology that Philip founded in 1890 merged with Lewis Institute in 1940 to form the Illinois Institute of Technology, and while the Armour name persists in some building names, the direct connection to the family is largely forgotten. The stockyards where Philip built his empire closed in 1971, replaced by industrial parks and residential development. The packing houses where thousands of workers processed millions of animals are gone entirely, demolished and forgotten. Prairie Avenue has been partially preserved as a historic district, but the Armour Mansion is not among the survivors. The lot where it stood is anonymous, notable only for a small marker that most people walk past without reading. The palace that once defined the street, that represented the peak of Chicago's Gilded Age excess, has vanished so completely that visitors to the area would never know it existed. The broader lesson of the Armour story is about the illusion of permanence that wealth creates. Philip Danforth Armour believed he was building something that would last for generations. He established a business empire, constructed a palace, founded educational institutions, created a family legacy. He did everything that wealthy men of his era believed would ensure immortality of a kind, having your name and your accomplishments remembered long after you were gone. It didn't work. 2 generations after his death, the business was gone from family control, the fortune was exhausted, the mansion was demolished, and the family name was largely forgotten outside of historical research. Philip's grandson died in modest circumstances, supported by a pension from a company his family no longer owned. The great-grandchildren never knew wealth. The dynasty lasted barely 50 years from founding to final collapse. This pattern repeated throughout America's Gilded Age. The great industrial fortunes of the late 19th century, built on railroads and steel and meat packing and oil, were concentrated in one generation and then dispersed. Some families managed the transition better than others. The Rockefellers created foundations and trusts that preserved wealth across generations. The Carnegies gave most of it away, establishing libraries and institutions that still bear the name. The Vanderbilts divided it among too many heirs and watched it evaporate. The Armours followed the Vanderbilt pattern, build spectacular monuments, divide the fortune, fail to adapt to changing circumstances, collapse into obscurity. The mansion on Prairie Avenue was just the most visible symbol of that failure. It represented the peak of the dynasty and witnessed its complete destruction, dying alongside the fortune that created it. In the end, the Armour Mansion's fate was the opposite of the breakers. Where the Vanderbilt Palace was saved by surrender, by giving up family ownership and becoming a museum, the Armour Mansion was lost through stubbornness, through the family's inability to recognize when they had to let go. By the time anyone realized the building needed public support to survive, it was too late. The decay was too advanced, the costs too high, the will to save it too weak. The story of the Armour Family Mansion is the story of American industrial wealth in microcosm. Explosive creation, brief glory, then rapid destruction, leaving only ruins and regrets. Philip Danforth Armour built an empire on meat and blood. His sons and grandsons watched it collapse into bankruptcy and abandonment. The palace that was supposed to prove the family's permanence lasted barely 60 years before being demolished by time and neglect. Today, Chicago remembers the stockyards as history. The meatpacking district is a footnote in textbooks. The men who built fortunes on cattle and hogs are mostly forgotten. And the mansion where they celebrated their triumph and witnessed their fall exists only in photographs. A ghost that haunts a vacant lot on Prairie Avenue, reminding us that even the greatest fortunes and the grandest palaces are ultimately temporary, that wealth and monuments both eventually crumble into dust, and that the only thing permanent is change.